Kannan Gopalakrishnan. He was working as a senior architect at Engineering Design Research Centre, L&T Construction, India's largest construction company. He's also worked on projects ranging from institutional buildings to international airports, apartment complexes to aircraft hangars. He's also attended 3 international conferences and 2 national conferences, and has also presented technical papers at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, Delhi, and the MSRIT, Bangalore. He's also won the national championship at Archaman at the India's largest architecture quiz. Sir Kannan Gopalakrishnan currently runs a design firm, Habitat Design Studio, and he is also a visiting faculty at the renowned architecture schools in Tamil Nadu.
Welcome back to UGC lecture series. This is AR 6602, History of Architecture and Culture 6. We are in Unit 1, we are critiquing modernism. This is lecture number 2. If you remember the previous lecture, we saw Team 10 and brutalism. We saw what happened after modernism. We saw how people criticized modernism, and which led to the start of Team 10 and decline of SWAYAM. We also saw how brutalism and neo-structuralism was formed, and today we will extend this and we will study a little more deeper about people in Team 10. We will be doing a detailed study on Allison and Peter Smithson, and we will be doing a study on Aldo van Eyck. Allison and Peter Smithson. Allison and Peter were among the most influential architects, and at the same time they created so much controversy in the mid 20th century. These people did their part in fledging the British pop art movement with their famous landmark buildings such as the Economist building, the Robin Hood Gardens housing complex, and other buildings that they designed. Their subsequent projects being the 1956 House of the Future, the Visionary Home exhibited at the Daily Mall, Ideal Home exhibition, early 1960s Economist building, early 1970s Robin Hood Gardens housing complex in East London, and a lot of other projects. These projects were infused with the same energy, the same ideal that these guys have been doing ever since the 10th SWAYAM Congress. So they built schools, they built workplaces, they built homes, and they all worried only about the progressive society, the way the society has changed after the World War and the way the society has changed after modernism. They called the society a meritocratic society. Bureaucracy, aristocracy were all passé, and now they call the society meritocratic society, and that is a progressive society for which Allison and Peter Smithson designed all their post-war buildings. Allison and Peter Smithson's competition was intended to bring together the famous reconstruction of post-war ruins project, the City of London. It was a bold, brash vision of a completely new urban form that people have not seen or heard of before. The plan was simple. It was intended to bring together people of high densities together in a way that it created an infinitely rich and satisfactory way of living inside the cities. So they want to bring in people closer for a packed living. To achieve this packed living concept, they arrived at another concept which they called the streets in the air. These connected clusters will be connected by corridors or streets in the air, which will be predominantly pedestrian, and it will be accessible above and below each mid-street level. They believed that the concentrating pedestrian circulation would create the community bonding, and to bring that kind of a community back into the architecture that was so rustic and so plain in modern terms, and this was some of the more bombastic and monumental SWAYAM modernist housing projects. So in these kind of projects, these people wanted to bring in one element that the SWAYAM did not have, the humanity aspect. So these people wanted to have to bring people closer to each other so that they can infuse the sense of humanness inside the monumental SWAYAM modernist housing projects. They separated the pedestrian streets from the ground. The ground was no longer the pedestrian street because they wanted to give way to the modern growing automobile industry. everybody were buying automobiles, and the number of automobiles on the road drastically increased after the war, which meant that the roads needed to be wider, and roads were always filled with traffic and automobiles. Well, if passenger traffic is also put on the street, it will cause two problems. One, the safety of the passengers, and number two, the pollution and the noise, the air, everything gets polluted for the people. So they run the risk of losing lives either quickly or slowly, which means that the pedestrian roads cannot be together with the vehicular roads. So what Allison and Peter Smithson did was they separated the pedestrian roads from the ground level, they put it on a higher level, and they called it the streets in the sky. Let us look at an interesting project called the Golden Lane Housing Project in London. Although the project mostly owed to Le Corbusier's earlier ideas and United Habitation and other projects which Le Corbusier had done, and this project was a little more radical on the part, because it emphasized less on the building itself, and it emphasized more on urbanization. Instead of the creation of network of continuous buildings arranged in a kind of cellular pattern, these people wanted to introduce the building as one discrete unit of urbanization. Such a network, what would happen if such a network were to work? They need to respond to the local requirements of people, and they need to work based on the local land conditions, topography, the soil conditions, and etc. And whenever there is some change in the level, there would start simply creating another layer of urbanizing upon the existing fabric of the city, and the existing fabric of the city is not going to change. So there is just going to be another layer of urbanism over the existing layer. This is take a look at the project which they had designed. The clustered network is a flexible system. It was the rejection of imposition of a complex grid. What modernist buildings usually had was a complex grid pattern, and all the columns and all the positioning needs to be exactly fitted on to that particular grid, A1, A2, A3, B1, B2, B3. But this project is where they deviated from the complex grid, and then they came into a little more flexible grid project, and that is another way in which they broke out from the strict modernist rules. This project was presented at the Siam 9th Congress, and only after this project was presented at the 9th Congress, the Team 10 was formed in the upcoming years, and Allison and Peter Smithson became the most influential members of the Team 10 only after this project. These were some of the sketches and renderings made for this project, where people have tried out different orientations, different space compositions, volume compositions for the project. This is going to be a street with units facing on opposite sides of the street, where units can be arranged according to the spatial requirement over here and the changes in topography also. Although the emphasis on community, flexibility, pedestrian approach and adaptability is all good on one hand, the residential life from the streets has been detached, and that has been proven disastrous in a lot of cities. The person who is living in the city has to be close to the street. If I have distanced myself from the street, I no longer belong to the city. I belong in a capsule. So Allison and Peter Smithson, although all the community design, the flexibility model were all acceptable and appreciable to an extent, this distancing from the street kind of gave negative impact to this project. This is one of the sketches which were made by them, wherein they create cities, decentralized cities in office spaces, factories, craft areas, ceremonial areas, different areas of the city in different parts, where each area would be self-sustained in their needs. So what went wrong in the project? People said that they were detached from the streets. So what happens if they get detached from the streets? It's a matter of urban scale and the dismissal of urban block as the classic element of cities. In every city, the building block of a city is the urban block. The block needs to be surrounded by streets on all four sides, and the urban block needs to have all the basic facilities covered within itself. So that is the main fundamental functional unit of a city, and if that's not going to be there, the city is not going to function the way people have been in the city so long. And if you want to change the complete way of looking at cities, you need to start by changing the mindset of people. The mind of the people have been set to a certain type of living, and when we think of cities, we have a certain image in mind, and when that image is disturbed, people don't have a sense of belonging for the city. There was a project called a Sprangel block in Rotterdam, which was a great success. They also employed pedestrian streets in the air, and they linked buildings with each other, and even though they linked buildings, they had a clear disposition within the city block. They had a city block, and then all the buildings were connected to each other, and without that, the Sprangel block project could not have been a success. The assemblage of buildings, when you put all the city block buildings together, they have to have a relationship with the street, and the relationship has to be, in a philosophical sense, a little more traditional, and that has to create open spaces, semi-private spaces, semi-public spaces, and then a private space. That is the traditional flow of spaces within the whole city block. That is what needs to be done in a particular city block when you're designing it. Allison and Peter Smithson also designed interior streets in the air, and therefore called them as supportive streets to the real streets of the city, and they were also visibly connected to the pedestrian spaces below in multiple levels within the same block. Take a look at the picture here. Every third floor, 1, 2, 3, every third floor there is a street or a corridor that connects all these spaces together, and all these spaces are connected again to each other and also to the street below. Similarly, here in this building, every 1, 2, 3, every third street will have a corridor space, and then the corridor is again connected through staircases, through lobbies, and in this part which is not seen here, and then it is connected to the main street of the city. The initial trajectory for the Influx Studio is a precedent study of notable housing projects which happened previously, and take the ideas from those projects, reiterate them for polyvalence, variability and interchangeability, intermediate, indeterminate spaces, open spaces, and mass customization. You add all these elements to it, and that is what Allison and Peter Smithson did in their projects. Specific charge is the dissection of the Golden Lane project by Allison and Peter Smithson, because when they took the project, all they did was they did a lot of study on the previously existing housing projects and how they worked and all that. They took all their ideas and they took 4 or 5 really important aspects, and then they compared all these projects with those ideas, and that is what made all the difference. And those important aspects for them, according to them, being polyvalence, variability, interchangeability, and mass customization for people. So these are the things that these guys talked about. According to them, the goal is to collect, filter, analyze and represent information on the assigned project as it explicitly relates to the issues below. These are drawings of the Golden Lane project, and according to legends, Allison and Peter Smithson gave a few schematics here and there, and then they also wrote in the drawing that the drawing suggested here should be considered as a minimum. Wherever further explanation is encouraged should be undertaken with the project. So that is what these people told. They gave basically minimum standards for construction, and wherever further exploration is required, so they allowed for further exploration. They encouraged all these additional things that could be done in the project. So Allison and Peter Smithson took care of the following things, and you can see in the screen below: massing, unit type, fenestration, circulation, systems and revisions. We can just take, we'll just take a quick look at what the ideas were about. For massing, they describe with particular attention to the interaction of mass with respect to context, ground plane and natural light. For them, a mass should have a context, should have a meaning, and it has to have certain relationship with the ground plane, the existing ground plane, and it needs to correspond to the natural light direction. And then comes unit types, individual unit arrangements, and global unit distribution. What Allison and Peter Smithson do is they create the plan for one single unit, and they try to interpolate all these single unit plans into diversities, and they form the block plan, and then the block plan becomes the whole society plan, and that is when the whole thing starts. So they make multiple of these individual unit arrangements, and that is what forms a nice distribution diagram in the whole project itself. Fenestration. According to them, fenestration describes at the level of the individual window overall composition. So they did not work on fenestration because of one issue. Like for example, modernism would take elevational symbolism and it would neutralize all the elevation features into one single line. But what Allison and Peter Smithson did was, in section, they drew sections and they placed the windows in section so that the individual room which the window is positioned with will have a certain reason for why the window is kept. At the same time, they took the same section and they created an elevation, and then the overall composition of the elevation should also match, should also work to a good extent. So that is how these people started working. They didn't start from the elevation and then manage or be okay with whatever that happened in the section, but they worked the other way around. They first worked on a section, they chose the room, and they chose the window type, height, location, and everything, and then from there they interpolated it to the elevation, which according to them worked. Moving on to circulation, they show circulation in relation to typical and emergency situation, overall and within the units. There are 4 kinds of circulations according to Allison and Peter Smithson. They show normal circulation, emergency times circulation, overall circulation of the whole project, and within the units, between the units and within the units, the kind of circulation that they have. These were the things that mattered to them. Moving on to systems, major construction to include diagrams of structure, envelope, and mechanical. Revisions, place the precedent study on the studio site as a plan and as a massing diagram. Like we discussed earlier, they always work on the precedent plans and precedent building study, and then they do extensive studies on those drawings, and only then they are ready to build another building. These are some of the projects which they had worked on. It's interesting to note the topography in the building. This picture on the right here is Robin Hood Gardens, and it is a social housing complex in the east of London. This project was completed in early 70s. This building, this brutalist structure, it is still standing as an example of all the theories that they had written and converted all the theories to practice. These practices today face an uncertain future because people are planning to pull this building down. This was built in a post-war Britain where presidential towers were being built as a symbol of progress after the war. As you all know, Britain won the war. So, as a mark of victory on the war, they need to show off to the people that they are being a progressive nation here. So, to show progress, all the residential towers and high-rise buildings were built as a symbol. So, this building was supposed to be a symbol, and this is what Allison and Peter Smithson created. There were a lot of buildings that were developed and during that particular time. The Robin Hood Gardens were one of them, and the Balfron Tower nearby to that particular place was also another one of them. And the 2 building stands today with just 1 or 2 streets between them, built within a decade of one another, and there is one major difference between the 2 buildings. Balfron Tower status as a listed building protects it from being torn down because it is now cited as an important architectural work, while Robin Hood Gardens has been denied the status of a listed building. So, Robin Hood Gardens is facing a problem of demolition, even though it is one of the best examples of post-war architecture in Britain, and it is being denied the status of a listed building, so which is now on the verge of extinction. Smithson's preached modern architecture which are designed with low cost and locally available materials. They were categorized as brutalists and sought for to each building to be designed according to its location and its own use, not as a global standard. From these ideals, they created their own aesthetic, the utilitarian aesthetic. It reflects all the conditions of their built form that they had, all the 6 features that we discussed earlier today. Allison and Peter Smithson were determined to improve people's lives through design. They believed that through design, people can make a difference in people's lives. So, the communal space, the garden space which they had designed, created a rising hill which were remnants from the construction. This communal space is an essential part of the Robin Hood Gardens, because this is where people gather and have their social space. So, this social spaces were very important for Allison and Peter Smithson, because that is one of the ways where they can make people's lives better. So, this Robin Hood Gardens was seen as their chance to prove their vision for a progressive social housing, and they came up with this kind of a project. This is how it looked from the outside, and a street in the sky looks like this. Like I discussed earlier in one of the projects, every 3rd level of the building includes a wide concrete balcony jutting off towards the center of the site, overlooking the garden. So, from the street to the sky, they can actually look into the garden. The balconies are wide enough for multiple people to walk and even for children to play in the balcony. This is one of the concepts where the Smithsons were very proud of, because they thought all the kids would come and play in the corridor, and all the people will come and watch the garden, and they'll have a street like experience on the corridor, except that it created a sense of a corridor and not a street. From the beginning, the Robin Hood Gardens project has been the center of a debate concerning its success, because some people say it's a success and some people say it's not that successful. Initially, the structural issues of the building raised the cost of the building enormously, and the maintenance was another big problem. A serious denial in upkeep and maintenance of the apartment were becoming less desirable places to live, but people didn't want to live there anymore, and the developers are eager to demolish the buildings, so because they can expand their own visions of the future, and they can build a much more better building for the present day. Although this building was constructed like 45 years ago, and it still actually is a good project to live in, but people thought that it is not a very desirable place to live, because there was a serious denial in upkeep and maintenance of the project. So, one thing led to another, and now the building is all set to be demolished. Why are we demolishing a building? If London intends to keep the Robin Hood Gardens, what they will have to do is they have to reinvest in the renovation of the building, and the renovations of this building would come at a much higher cost than the current plan to demolish it. So, they do the renovations, they do all the upkeep, maintenance and everything, and they still keep a 45-year-old building, and that is going to cost much higher than demolishing and building a new construction. Moving on to Aldo van Eyck. According to him, a house must be like a small city. If it's to be a real house, a city like a large house if it is to be a real city. According to Aldo van Eyck, a house must be a small city if it is to be a real house. At the same time, a city must be a large house if it is to be a real city. So, Aldo van Eyck draws parallel to city and house, and he says that a city is nothing but a large house and a house is nothing but a small city. Aldo van Eyck was interested in non-hierarchical development of cities, and in his project Amsterdam Orphanage, he creates buildings with many in-between conditional spaces to break down a lot of hierarchy of spaces. The building is constructed out of 2 size of modules, one smaller size module for the residences and the larger size module for all the community spaces. The modules consist of 4 round columns at the corners with a domed roof, and it has precast concrete on the top. This is how the project looks like. These are the 4 columns, and there is a domed roof on top. The facade of the building are made of solid wall or a glass wall. This is how the plan of the building is. The smaller units are the residential units. The larger units are the community spaces. The units of program are laid out on an orthogonal grid. Units project off to two diagonal paths, one here and one over here. Aldo van Eyck creates an equal amount of negative spaces from the positive he has formed. Each individual unit is then neighbored by its own outer space. Each individual unit has its own outdoor space. The large courtyard is diagonally offset from the residential spaces, and the entrance of the admin spaces are connected with the streets. So, they are all following the same principle. If you look at the bigger picture here, he avoids creating a central point within the orphanage because he allowed fluidic connections between all the spaces. So, there is no actual center point of the orphanage. The Amsterdam orphanage is his idea of a balanced community. This design earned him international recognition and established his humanist theories in Unbuilt project. He also designed a lot of temporary pavilions in the summer of '66 to host sculptures, and it was destroyed a few months later. It was rebuilt in 2006 in the Garden of Netherlands. The construction is a careful exercise in plan. It has 6 parallel walls which are almost 4 meter high, and he creates multiple patterns inside these things, and in view it looks like this. This is how the playgrounds look like. So, this is how the playground looks like in plan. It creates very interesting spaces for people to play around, creating interesting spaces for children to play around, varied levels where children can jump around, and this was what was there in that particular place. And Aldo van Eyck creates in the same space with doing nothing on the walls around it, just by manipulating the floor. He has created such a beautiful playground area. He is a master of making playgrounds, and he has also written a book about playgrounds on the city. Let's quickly move on to what we learnt in this episode. We understood the work of post-war architects such as Allison and Peter Smithson. We understood the public spaces designed by Aldo van Eyck. We understood political and economic scenario of post-war Europe, how positive architecture helped revive the cities of Europe again. With this, you should be able to answer the following questions that are going to appear on your screen right now. How were the economic scenario of post-war Europe? Who were the key architects in that scenario? Who were Allison and Peter Smithson? Explain any one work in detail with the sketches. Give an example of public architecture of Aldo van Eyck. With these questions, you should be able to have an adequate knowledge on this topic. I look forward to meeting you with more such interesting topics and lectures. So, thank you.